Well, the end of an era on the horizon in Afghanistan. U.S. Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta has announced that America's longest war is coming to an end. By next year, the U.S. and NATO aims to draw down troops and end all combat in Afghanistan. With this pullout and the official end to the war, we want to take a minute to look back at what this all means and what has actually been accomplished there. Well, the last time the U.S. ended a war without a decisive victory was in Vietnam. For many, the fall of Saigon left a bitter taste in their mouths. It was, in many ways, an end to an extremely unpopular war. In the early hours of April 30th, 1975, the capital of South Vietnam fell to the communist north. 2 Americans were killed and thousands fled to the U.S. Embassy and were evacuated. It was the single largest helicopter evacuation in history. Well, this may be exactly what the U.S. is trying to avoid as they plan their departure from Afghanistan. The way the U.S. leaves Afghanistan has the potential to define the entire war. And if you remember, the last people to exit the country were the Soviets back in 1989. Here they are with their heads held high as they depart the country. Now, as the U.S. prepares to leave Afghanistan, with thousands dead, billions of dollars spent, was a decade of bloodshed and war all for nothing? Former U.S. Marine and RT blogger Jake Diliberto joins us now for more. Welcome, Jake. So violence in Afghanistan at its worst now since the U.S. went into the country over 10 years ago. Now Afghanis are bracing themselves for the Taliban to return back to power. This seems to be a far cry from a victory for the U.S. Was the war then a waste of time, in your opinion?
Oh, yeah, it's good to see you, and good job. Kudos to RT for picking up the story. A lot of the mainstream media is not covering this news revelation. I think that we have to take the war in 2 parts. First, the United States' response to 9/11, I think, was reasonable, was done just, and I think that the U.S. performed relatively well. They had Afghan support at the very beginning. But when we chose to go into Iraq, the U.S. totally got sidetracked. We missed the boat on capturing bin Laden. We totally took our eye off the ball, which led to a series of problems that we had to deal with in Afghanistan later on. And when Obama came into office, there was a series of other dilemmas he had to deal with. And I think that the second part, what we've been doing recently, this nation building, is the part that's the problem, and that this part has not been justified, it's not been worth it. Had we taken bin Laden out when we had him at Tora Bora, had we done the job at the very beginning and gotten out, we wouldn't be in this problem. We wouldn't have spent all those billions of dollars. And also, I think that you probably wouldn't have had the Iraq War had we gotten bin Laden in 2001. So I think the second half of this has been a big mistake.
And now with the impending drawdown of troops in Afghanistan, and as the U.S. reflects on our time spent there over the past decade, what would you say was really accomplished there?
Well, I was in Afghanistan in 2009. I just returned. I was a part of a series of UN delegations that met with Taliban leaders and U.S. officials and Afghan leaders. And I'd say that the departure comes at a time where the United States has recognized that its military can only do certain things, that the real crisis, the real problem in Afghanistan is a political problem resting inside of Kabul, with Karzai essentially being, the government abuser-in-chief, the mayor of Kabul, and the Pakistani ISI continuing to fund the Taliban and the Haqqani network. And I think that as the U.S. leaves, you're going to see an increased Taliban influence. I don't think the Taliban's ever going to be what it was in the 1990s, but there's certainly going to be somewhat of an influence for the foreseeable future.
And do you think, with the Pentagon making this announcement, that they have come to the realization that a war in Afghanistan against the Taliban is not really winnable at this point?
Yeah, I think that the Pentagon has seen that they need to change policy. When Secretary Gates left, he made a couple remarks saying that basically that the real problem in Afghanistan is the political problem. It's not the military. And we just saw the Deputy Secretary Michelle Flournoy leave. And I think there's some in-workings within the Pentagon of arguing about what needs to occur. And Leon Panetta has said, essentially, that nation building and counterinsurgency is not what the U.S. should be doing. So I think that it's more about less about winning and losing, but more about the U.S. making a decision that it's not in its interest anymore to be nation building. And I think that's a profound move from the inside of the Pentagon.
And Jake also wanted to talk about this highly classified report that was leaked. It shows that the Taliban, backed by Pakistan, will rise back to power. So this decade-long Western intervention, I mean, what has it done to curb Taliban influence in the region?
Well, a couple of things. First of all, nobody has heard or seen from Mullah Omar since 2002. And so the leadership of the Taliban, of the Quetta Taliban, the old Taliban, is essentially become inconsequential. But we have seen an anti-Karzai movement grow. There has been a growing movement that's anti-Western, and of course that's what the West wants. A government favorable to itself. So there's some problems there, and also I think the big problem is that we still haven't had Pakistan come on the side of the Afghans, or Pakistan be really a real partner for the United States. So I think that you're going to see a continued rise in power from the Haqqani network specifically, and I think that the Taliban, the ideology is still going to be strong with Pashtuns, regardless of whether the U.S. is there or not, because we haven't had Pakistan drop its support for the Taliban.
And the U.S. Has been trying to build some kind of an alliance with Pakistan in an effort to help fight against the Taliban in Afghanistan. In light of this recent report, this classified report that was released, I mean, is that going to show that with this kind of anti-American sentiment that is spreading there, that any ties or relationship with Pakistan is going to be is unlikely?
Yeah, this is a great question. It's a great point. What's going to happen with Pakistan? God only knows. Pakistan is, it's the moon with gravity. It's so chaotic. There's simply like 10 militant movements that no one has control of. The U.S. has continued its drone strikes, and as a result, there's been an increase in Punjabi violence. Pakistan is just an absolute mess. There's just no way of really dealing with this. So I think basically that the U.S. is going to try to take its hands off, and hoping that with a less footprint, that perhaps the violence and the increased militancy amongst those 10 different militancies, the TTP and Haqqani and Quetta Taliban, that perhaps less of a footprint might make these movements decrease. I think that's what the U.S. is betting on.
And lastly, Jake, just want to ask you, as an Iraq and Afghanistan war veteran yourself, how does it feel to see this announcement that troops, after a decade of fighting, are finally leaving these countries?
Well, I think that this is one of the best things for us because, when we started this thing in 2001, we had no idea that this would take 10 years, 12 years, and it's been our longest war in our history, and it's totally exhausted the U.S. military. Suicide rates at an all-time high, divorce rates at 80%. The U.S. military certainly has taken a drain, and withdrawing from these nation-building operations is really, really good for the morale of the troops. I also think that overall it's good for America's strategic interests because now we don't have our military bogged down in a nation-building campaign, and God knows where, halfway around the world, for a decade and some. So it's good, and from our point of view, I think that we're happy to see Afghans take charge and the U.S. not to be in charge of the fate of that country.
Jake, a pleasure to have you on the show. As always, that was RT blogger and former U.S. Marine, Jake Diliberto.